Welcome to The Camera, where John will teach you the difference between point and shoot, the phone, a digital SLR, a mirrorless camera, and different brands and systems. He will then teach you shutter speed from 1/30th of a second through to 1/500th of a second so you can master motion.
Welcome to Camera 101. My name is John Gringo. In this class, we're going to be covering the technical operation of cameras and lenses. Now, photography has always been a little complicated, and with modern cameras, well, it's gotten even more complicated so. Cameras do have some automated features on them. You can put them into a fully automated mode. But if you want to be a great photographer, you need to have control over what you're doing, which means taking control and understanding what your camera does. You can't expect greatness to come with automation. You need to figure out what the features are, how they work, and how to use them yourself. And that's what we're going to be doing in this class for all the various and most important features in your camera, your shutter speed, your aperture, your ISO, and on and on. There's a long list of items that you need to get right in order to get great photos. Now, this class is for a wide variety of students. You might just be beginning photography and you've gotten your first camera with interchangeable lenses and you're kind of wondering, what do all these buttons and dials do? Well, this is going to be a good place to start because we're going to cover things right from the very beginning. You might have more experience and now you're focusing on portrait photography. Well, there's a lot of settings on your camera that need to be put, let's put it in a very particular way for doing portraits the best that they can be done. And so whether you're a beginner or more advanced, this is a good class to brush up on all those fundamentals for making sure that you're getting things right in the camera. Let's take a look at what we'll be going through in this class. We'll be talking first about the camera. We'll talk about different types of cameras because there's a number of different options available these days with some different implications. And then we'll be talking about one of the most important controls in the camera, and that is the shutter. We'll have another section on the sensor. There's different size sensors, different capabilities with cameras, and of course with that comes the ISO or the sensor setting. We have a section, and one of my favorite sections is the lens, having different lenses. When you change the lens, you really change the camera. You change your perspective and your point of view, and you can really have a big impact on the way your subject is going to look by which lens you use and how you use it. The focusing section is really important because you have to get that right in the camera. You cannot fix that later, and there's a number of options and some new options that are great for the newest cameras that are coming out on the market. And then we get into the exposure section, which is maybe the most important section, figuring out what is the best exposure settings for any particular case of portrait photography. And we're going to walk you through it step by step. We have a short section on flash to give you some tips and hints on using an on-camera or a built-in flash that'll help your portraits have a more natural look. And finally, camera setup will take us through the final settings of a camera, all those little things that are also important that you want to have customized to your particular camera. So this is going to be a great course to cover all the basics and fundamentals for operating your camera. Let's start with the camera. Obviously, a very important subject when it comes to photographers, and there's a lot of different things to talk about. So let's first talk about the different types of cameras that are currently available and how we might want to choose one or the other for doing portrait photographs. The first choice, and not my favorite choice, but it's the first one we're going to talk about because this is one of the most common, is the point and shoot. And if you want, you can throw your mobile phone in here as well because it operates in somewhat the same manner. Now, the way these cameras work is they are all-in-one devices, camera, sensor, lens, all built in together, very convenient, very small in size. Light will come in through the lens and go straight to the image sensor, which will feed the image onto the LCD on the back of the camera. And I like the LCD on the back of these cameras and phones and so forth because you get to look at your subject with both eyes. And I tend to be a better judge of composition and framing when I'm using both eyes. However, that has two distinct disadvantages. Number one is it's not easy to see under bright lighting conditions. If you have direct sun on your device, it's nearly impossible to get a good view of what's going on. The second problem is that it's relatively small, and it's hard to tell if your subject is truly sharp without zooming in and checking every single time you take a photograph. And so it's not the best device for doing great photographs because you don't have a good view of your subject and you can't be sure if it's sharp unless you are checking every single photograph. When it comes time to take a photo, to control the light, the camera uses a leaf shutter and aperture unit that controls both the aperture and the shutter unit at the same time. Now, the sensor needs to prep in order to capture an image, so it closes all the light off, the sensor preps, and then the shutter opens, and this is your exposure. Then it closes again to end the exposure, and then it has to open again in order to send you information on how to frame your next shot. And so this is what happens every time you take a photo. It's small, it's quiet, it's quick, it's convenient, it's very easy. It's a nice system for taking basic photographs. But for taking great photographs, it's got some limitations. And so, as I say, it's a very convenient, low-cost way of taking photographs, but the problem is that the smaller sensors in these devices mean less performance, not as good under low light, not as good when you want to make enlargements with it. They do not have a viewfinder, which means it's harder to see if it's in focus or if it's being framed properly. And there's a limited number of options. It depends on which product you're looking at, but in general, there's a limited number of either additional features that it has or options that you can add to it. And so it might be fine for taking on vacation, but for doing great portrait work, there are many other ways to do a little better. The next category is the most popular category, which is the digital single lens reflex. This has been the most popular system for about 20 years, and before that, we could drop the digital, and it was the single lens reflex that was popular for about 30, 40, or 50 years. And that's because it's got a great viewing system, it's got a large image sensor, and these are large, very mature systems that have lots and lots of accessories. So let's look at how these cameras work. We have interchangeable lenses, which have very high quality optics in them that we can interchange. Inside the lenses is an aperture unit that can control how much light gets into the sensor. It can open, it closes down. It never completely closes, but it does get smaller in size. And that's one way of controlling light. As light comes into the camera, it hits the mirror, and this is the reflex portion in single lens reflex. And it is there to bounce light up so that you can see what's going on at any time through your camera. So it bounces light up to a focusing screen, around a prism, and out to your eye. So when you hold the camera up to your eye, the camera doesn't even need to be turned on. You can see exactly the angle of view. You can see whether it's in focus. You can see if you have any filter effects. It's a very good viewing experience, and that's something photographers that take great value in, is a good viewing experience, because you want to be able to really see your subject very well. When it comes time to take a photo, you're going to press down on the shutter release, and that mirror needs to flip up and get out of the way so that light can get back to the image sensor. Now, before it gets back there, it's got to get past the shutter unit, and there's two parts to the shutter unit, the first curtain and the second curtain. Now, I'm going to show this to you from the side and from the front so that you can more easily see what's going on. When you are taking a picture, the first curtain will drop away, exposing the sensor to light. This is your exposure. And then when it's done, the second curtain will come down and block the light off. And it uses it in this manner so that each pixel is exposed to light for the same amount of time, and you have an even exposure across the entire frame. The mirror then returns to its lowered position so that you can see and compose the next shot. And cameras will do this automatically, 10 frames a second in some cases. It's a very simple system where you lose sight of your subject for just a moment while it's actually capturing that particular photograph. And so this system, as I say, has been very popular due to the large image sensor that they have in general and the very good viewing system. Now, the downside to the SLR is that the viewfinder is only a preview. It's what you see with your eyes and the glass and the mirror, but it's not a digital image. And so it doesn't show you the exposure, it doesn't show you the white balance. And so that's what I mean by the digital assistance that you could possibly get in cameras that we're going to talk about next. And so these are very well-honed systems. They're what a lot of the professionals are shooting with because they're very large and they've been around for a very long time. But there's a new kid on the block, and it's changing the whole look of the photography world when it comes to equipment. So with the SLR, the minor little problem that they have is that mirror in the device. It's got a couple little issues. It takes up a bit of space, and because it's moving around a lot, it can cause a vibration problem. So if we were to take that mirror out, there's a lot of things that we could do. The mirror causes the lens mount and the image sensor to be a certain distance apart, and that makes designing perfect lenses very, very challenging to do. So if we were to take that mirror out, well, we could make the camera body smaller, we could get rid of some of those other unneeded devices in the camera, and we could reduce the size of our camera. We could make lenses a little bit easier to design by having a lens mount closer to the sensor, and we get ourselves a mirrorless camera. And so this is the most popular trend in photography, is new mirrorless cameras. And they offer us a new capability and a new way of taking photographs. And so in this case, light is going to come in through the lens and it's going to go straight to the sensor. The shutter is going to have to open up so that the sensor can grab light and send that information to the LCD screen on the back of the camera and the electronic viewfinder so that you can hold the camera up to your eye and see what the camera is pointed at. The modern electronic viewfinders are very good, they're very high resolution, and they have the benefit of showing you what your exposure is, whether you have the right white balance set, gives you a lot of very good information about what you are shooting, and that's part of the photographer experience, is a good viewfinder. Now when it comes time to take a photo, the shutter action is a little bit different than with the SLR. What happens here is that the shutters are open so that light can get to the image sensor so you can see what's going on. And then when it's time to take a photo, it has to close one shutter, prepare the shutter, then it's going to open for your exposure, and it's going to close, and then it's going to open again so that you can see in order to compose your next shot. And it will do this each time you take a photograph. And so this system is very quiet, there's not very much vibration, and it works very well in the mirrorless cameras. And so it's a very good system, reduced the size of the cameras and made lenses a little bit easier to design. And so overall, it's a very good system in its inherent design. There are many cameras out on the market that are available in a mirrorless format now. All the manufacturers, for the most part, are making a mirrorless version of them out there. They may have different size sensors. In general, these are newer cameras, which means the lens lineup is a bit smaller in size. For companies like Nikon and Canon that have a long legacy of lenses with a different system, they've come out with adapters that you can seamlessly use those older lenses on the newer cameras. And so it looks to be very much a way going forward for most photographers. And so if you were buying a camera brand new right now, I would say look most strongly at a mirrorless camera because they offer a lot of possibility for the future. Now, mirrorless cameras are not perfect, but they do have a lot of nice things about them. I love the final preview, being able to check exposure in there. If you are into shooting video, you can shoot video having it held up right up to your eye. And they have some new interesting autofocus options, and I'll talk more about those in the focus section in this class. The downsides at this point is the EVF, the electronic viewfinder, is not quite as sharp as the traditional SLR, but they have gotten good enough that more and more photographers are seeing them as very acceptable at this point, if not very good. They do use a bit more power because they're always seeming to be using a little bit more battery for those electronic viewfinders, and so you may want to get an extra battery with a mirrorless camera, but that is also improving as time goes on and they get more efficient. And as I say, they have somewhat limited systems in the number of native lenses at this point in time. This is changing very rapidly. The companies that have put out new mirrorless cameras are quickly following them with many, many lenses out there, so this is not really going to be a problem in the long term. It's just a short term, whether you have to use an adapted lens to fit your particular need right now. But mirrorless really seems to be the wave of the future, and it's what most cameras, most new cameras out on the market are coming out as. And so I would keep an eye on mirrorless because that might be your next camera. I'd like to talk for a moment about some of the different camera systems that are out there for the portrait photographer. So let's take a look at some of the popular brands and where they have cameras for the portrait photographer. Now, Canon is the largest of the manufacturers. They have more cameras out on the market than anyone else. They make cameras in a couple different categories. One is based off of full frame sensors, and one is based off of crop frame sensors. The smaller frame sensors tend to be a little bit more affordable and a little bit smaller in size. The full frame is where a lot of the professionals are in their photography. So the 5D Mark IV is probably one of the most popular cameras for the serious portrait photographer. Some are using a 5DS and SR because it has higher resolution. The 1DX Mark II is more of a sports camera, so you don't see too many people using that for portrait. But the 6D Mark II is an excellent camera as well for portrait photography. Doesn't have as many features, but for the basics of portrait work, it's just as good as the 5D Mark IV. The smaller cameras are also very good. It depends on what exact features you need and how much budget you have for them. But they're all very good cameras, and these are well-honed systems with lots and lots of lenses. As I've said in the last section, the trend is towards mirrorless. So Canon has come out with a cropped frame mirrorless category, and these not really designed for the portrait photographer in particular. These are more travel photography and casual photographers. But they recently did introduce a full frame mirrorless system, and you can see by the number of cameras and the lenses that they have announced already that this is a big direction for them. And so there is going to be more and more cameras. The R is kind of a mid-level camera. The RP is a new entry-level full-frame camera at a very affordable price. There's a limited system of lenses that are native to the camera, which means that just mount straight on there. But Canon has made an adapter where you can use all of the DSLR lenses on here. So you are open to use many, many different lenses with virtually no problems at all in their operation. And so for the future, I think the full-frame mirrorless is the way a lot of photographers are going to go, but right now the DSLR is the most popular with Canon. The arch rival of Canon is Nikon, another one of the great systems that are well-matured products, you might say. There's a lot of things out there. And very much like Canon, they have their crop frame system and they have their full frame system. The D850 or the D750 are some of the most popular photographers for portrait work, but you can use any of them with the right lenses, and there are certainly more than enough lenses with Nikon, as they've been adapting and changing their lenses with the same lens mount since about 1959 with modifications and changes along the way. They too are getting into the mirrorless game. They have gone with full-frame mirrorless, the Z7 and Z6, which are quite a bit smaller than the SLR systems. They offer a lot of good features. It's a limited collection of lenses at this time, not a lot of portrait specialist lenses, but like Canon, they have an adapter where you can use all of the DSLR lenses. So there is a great number of lenses that you can use in total for this, and they have put a lens roadmap out for these new mirrorless cameras that is extending several years into the future, and you can see it is a high priority for them in their lenses. So there's going to be a much more equipment coming for those mirrorless cameras. Sony's kind of the new kid on the block in some ways. They are very focused on technology. They have been working hard on their mirrorless systems, and so they've been focusing on their mirrorless crop frame and now their full frame systems. There does seem to be a pretty big difference between the full frame and the crop frame here. The crop frame seemed to be more geared towards the amateur, intermediate level photographer, travel photographer. They don't have a lot of portrait lenses that are designed for the crop frame system, but when you get up to the full frame system, they have a number of great cameras. The A7R III is a very high resolution camera. The A7 Mark III is one of the best cameras for the value when it comes to a full frame camera. And they have come out with a lot of mirrorless cameras. They went to this before anyone else in the full frame mirrorless category, and because of their head start, they have more lenses available. And so they have more lenses of all different types available than any of the other manufacturers right now. They are still maintaining a SLR system back from the days that they acquired Minolta, which is how Sony got into the game many, many years ago. And that's kind of a system that is on life support, you might say. It's not going to be around for much longer, so I wouldn't recommend new investment into their SLT system. They are focusing on the mirrorless system. Fuji is an interesting company because they have chosen to focus on the crop frame sensor, which is a little bit smaller. And so if you wanted to have a camera that was good for portrait photography, but that was a little bit smaller and a little bit lighter, I think this is where the best cameras are going to be had. They have a number of very good cameras. The X-T3 is going to be probably most people's favorite camera in this category. They have a number of good portrait lenses, and it's all probably going to be about 30% less in size, weight, and in price compared to the other ones that I've talked about before. Now, Fuji does also go bigger than full frame, and yes, you can go bigger than full frame. There's a whole group of medium format cameras out there. It's really beyond the scope of this class, but I just do want to mention it here real quickly that they are making medium format cameras, which could be very good for studio photography. as these cameras use a large sensor, the cameras are larger, the lenses are larger, and so it tends to be the type of item that works really well in a studio for very, very high resolution. But the smaller frame ones are great for people who like smaller cameras, especially ones that are a little bit more traditionally oriented. They have traditional shutter speed dials and some very traditional controls on them, which make them kind of fun to use. Now there's a bunch of other manufacturers. I don't have time to spend a lot of time on each one, but real quickly, Pentax has an SLR system. They haven't gone into mirrorless. They do have one full frame camera, but most of their lenses are crop frame. Olympus makes a micro 4/3 system, which is a very small sensor, great for travel photography. They do have some nice portrait lenses, but it is using a very small sensor. Leica makes some fantastic equipment. It is fantastic in price as well. They do have some very interesting things out there. It's probably not best for someone's first camera purchase because they are kind of unique products, but they are very high quality with that premium price. Panasonic is a company that is kind of new to photography in some ways, but they're very strong in video. And so people who like video and shooting stills have been very into them. Traditionally, they've been partnered with Olympus in this micro 4/3 very small sensor category, but they've introduced full frame cameras, and they're going to be doing a bit of both going into the future. And so you can shoot great portrait photographs with any of the systems that I've talked about. It's just a matter of which system you are comfortable and happy using, and if it feels better in your hand or has any special features that you might like. And so the choice of camera is not that important in some ways, but it is putting you into an ecosystem that you're going to have to live with probably for quite a while, because it's very expensive to move from one system to the next. For most people, the Canon, Nikon, and Sony system are going to provide them with the most opportunities out on the market today. Let's talk about shutter speeds. This is what's happening in the camera, and getting it set right is very important for shooting good portraits. All right, so here's a little quiz for you. Looking at the screen, which number is bigger? Well, your brain is going to say 8, but we're going to be talking about shutter speeds. And shutter speeds, for the most part, are fractions of a second. And a half second is bigger, longer period of time than 1/8 of a second. And your camera doesn't always show you these fractions, and so you need to be able to reverse this very quickly on the fly when you're shooting. So this is the list of shutter speeds as you might see it in a camera. Now, once again, the way the shutter speeds work is the shutter is going to open, expose the sensor for a particular amount of time, and then the second shutter is going to come down and end the exposure. And then it's going to return back to the beginning again. And so the question that we're really talking about here is, how long a time do we want to expose the sensor for portrait photography? Now, on really fast shutter speeds, it's kind of interesting because it scans the sensor in a very small strip. And this is going to be important when we get to flash photography. So remember that for the flash photography section. All right, the first thing I need to say about shutter speeds is that it's a bad name. It's not exactly describing what's going on. I think exposure time is a better explanation of what is going on, because it's how much time the sensor is exposed to light. The speed of the shutter is actually the same on all the photographs. It just depends on when they're timed. So let's look at these, and we'll start very simple. First off is a second. You all know what a second is. Well, when we go from 1 second to 2 seconds, that's pretty easy too. We've doubled the amount of time, and we've doubled the amount of light. And so if you wanted to make your picture much brighter, you would double the amount of light. And in photography, we use a term called stops. In this case, we would say it's a full stop brighter. Anytime you double something or cut it in half, we are changing by a stop of light. This actually comes from the term f-stop, but we've applied it to shutter speeds in other areas in photography. So going from 1 to 2 seconds doubles the time, doubles the light. Pretty easy to figure out. Many cameras will go all the way down to 30 seconds, and you know you are in full seconds when you see the little quotation mark besides the number. And so there are two different 2s. There's one with a little quotation, which means 2 seconds, and the straight 2 is a half second. Remember, it's 1/2. Now, some cameras might actually show this to you in a decimal form, as in 0.5, and decimal or fraction, it's the same. And so when we go from 1 second to 2 seconds, that's half as much time, it's half as much light. And so it's a very easy scale to work with this in this regard. A fairly normal shutter speed would be 125th of a second, and a very fast shutter speed might be 1/8,000th of a second. And so this is the range of shutter speeds that you work with in most photography. Now when it comes to portrait photography, generally speaking, you're going to be between a 60th of a second and 2/50th of a second for most type of shots. I prefer the slightly faster ones because then they mean less likely to have any blur. Now, if something's moving pretty quickly, somebody's running or they're flinging their hair or they're throwing something over their shoulder, then you might want to have an even faster shutter speed like 500 to 2,000th of a second. It's pretty hard to move faster than 2,000th of a second, so you don't really need the 4 and 8,000th of a second for motion. You're using it more for exposure control. If you were outside on a bright sunny day and you had your camera set up in a particular way, you might need 4 or 8,000th of a second simply to control the light. We will have some slow shutter speeds if you wanted to do some motion blur effect. If you wanted to have somebody walking or throwing something and have a little bit of blur to it, you might want to use these slower shutter speeds. And in general, in portrait work, you're just not going to use the really, really slow shutter speeds unless you're doing some sort of special effects or night photography. And so it's pretty regulated to those 60, 125, and 2/50th of a second when it comes to what shutter speeds you might choose for most portrait photographs. So why are you going to choose a specific speed? What's motivating you to choose it? Well, there are technical reasons. We need to get a technically correct exposure, so we might need to let in less light with a faster shutter speed or more light with a longer shutter speed. But also there's the aesthetics. What are we trying to do? Freezing motion, do we want a really sharp photograph, or do we want to show motion with a little bit of blur? And obviously when we have technical on one side and aesthetics on the other, sometimes we're going to get a conflict of what we want to do. Aesthetically we want to try to do something, but technically we can't do that. And so that's why we have shutter speeds, apertures, and ISO so that we can adjust one of the others to get what we want here or in other places. So let's take a closer look at these different shutter speeds, and what we need to be thinking about is time and motion. How much time is in the exposure, and how much is our subject moving during that particular period of time? And let's start off with the fastest of shutter speeds. It's pretty rare that you would actually shoot at 8,000th of a second, but if we do, we're going to get great sharpness with anything that's moving. And so if you want to look down here, you can actually see individual hair strands that are blowing in the wind, but we can see them nice and sharp and clear with an 8,000th of a second. 4,000th of a second. Once again, subject is moving very quickly. We may want to see that sand being flung up in the air, and it's going to be moving faster than most humans move because it's being thrown around and it's very small, so it moves very quickly. And we're also out on a bright sunny day, so we might need a faster shutter speed for controlling the exposure in this bright light situation. Now, I mentioned before that we rarely use 4 and 8,000th of a second for motion stopping capability. So here at 2,000th of a second, you can see when we zoom in, we can still see individual strands of hair blowing in the wind here. And so you really don't need more than 2,000th of a second for human type action that we're involved in most things for stopping motion. It's for exposure control that you'll choose something faster than 2,000th of a second. But if something is moving fairly quickly, 1,000th of a second, a person is walking, hair's blowing around, they're moving quickly, you want to make sure it's sharp, you could choose a very fast shutter speed like 1,000th of a second. Now one of my favorite shutter speeds is 500th of a second. And this stops fast human action. You might need 500 or 1,000 depending on how fast they are moving. But if people are walking very quickly and you want to make sure it is sharp as it can be, then 500th of a second is generally going to be a good choice here. Now you might be wondering, well, if 500 is good, would 1,000 be better, or 2,000, or something even faster? No, not necessarily. When it comes to shutter speed, the general rule is you want a shutter speed fast enough to stop the action, maybe one more for safety, but you don't want to go beyond it, because if we go beyond it, what's happening is that the camera is letting in very little light with the shutter, and it needs to make up for that light either with the aperture or the ISO. And you'll see as we go forward in this class, that's going to compromise those in some way, and it may not even be possible. So don't go overboard with shutter speed. Just do as much as necessary and maybe one for caution, and that would make sense. And so if 500 will do a good job, that's probably where you should be. So once again, subjects moving fairly quickly, they're moving their hands, they're moving the scarf very quickly. You want to make sure there's sharp detail in the face, the hands, the clothing. 500th of a second would do a good job for that. Now you can see here at 2/50th of a second, as she's throwing that sweater around her shoulder, there's a lot of blurriness on the sweater. And so if we want to see detail and texture in that fabric, 2/50th is not a fast enough shutter speed in this particular case. And so be aware of that, look for that, and then choose a faster shutter speed if necessary. One of my favorite shutter speeds for shooting portraits, kind of standard portraits, is 2/50th of a second. In most cases, 125 is great for it, but I always like having that one extra for caution. And the reason is because when I take a portrait, I like to be able to zoom in and see if it's sharp and have it just as sharp as can be. Every eyelash, everything is sharp, even if the model is moving just a little bit, or maybe I'm holding the camera and it's moving a little bit. And at 2/50th of a second, you'll always get sharpness in my mind. 125 is where a lot of people shoot their portraits. This is a very, very safe shutter speed because in reality, a lot of times you can hold the camera at a 60th of a second, and this is the one for safety. And so when you do this, if a subject is not moving around too much, 125th is a great, great choice. It depends a little bit on how much light you have. If you don't have a lot of light, 125 is going to be better than 250 because it's letting in more light. I think maybe one of the most dangerous shutter speeds is a 60th of a second, because for a lot of people, a 60th of a second, yeah, you can handhold a camera at a 60th of a second, it's not a problem. But it's deceptive because either you moving the camera or your subject moving around can often lead to blurriness when you shoot at a 60th of a second. And you'll look at this photograph and you'll rub your eyes and you'll squint and you're like, did I get that right? And then you'll be so disappointed because it was just a little bit too slow. And so try to avoid these slightly slower shutter speeds because you are very likely to get blur. And it may look fine as a thumbnail, and if you're not going to show anyone the picture very large, you can get away with it. But once you blow it up, once you start looking at it, a 30th of a second, a 60th of a second, a good number of those are going to have problems. Now, when you get down to the slower shutter speeds, you're obviously trying to intend to have some blurriness in your shot. And so on this one, we're having some fun. We're moving around a little bit. We're throwing some things around so that we can get some movement in these slower shutter speeds. And so these are special effects, and I will have to admit on these, you do tend to have to shoot a lot of them to get them right, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong in these shots at these very slow shutter speeds. But when they come out, they can be a lot of fun, and they can be very creative and different in the way they look. And so this is a great place to experiment with different types of photography. Now, everything below this is special effects section, and we're not going to get into it in this class. And so nighttime photographers, very, very low light photographers. The problem is that this is just really hard for any person to stand still or to sit still to get a sharp photo in this case. And so this is a special effects category beyond the scope of this class, but it can be fun to play in here. So I'm not discouraging you from experimenting in here. It's just not where you're going to get your traditional great portrait photographs. One of the most important things is holding the camera correctly when you are shooting photos. And there are two different ways that people commonly hold the camera, and there is one way that is notably better than the other. And the way that you can easily remember this is that with your left hand holding the camera, it is thumbs up. So let me give you an example with my camera here. And I realize that when you first grab a camera, you're going to put your right hand on the grip. That makes perfectly good sense. And a lot of people grab it with their left hand. Now the problem is that the elbow is floating out here in space and doesn't have any sense of support. If you put your thumb up and kind of cradle the lens in your hand, you can put your elbow in on your torso here, and you'll have another point of contact along with your forehead and your other hand. And so you'll have 3 points of contact so that you can hold your camera as steady as possible. And you want to hold your camera as steady as possible because that's just one more place you can get blur in a photograph. Now, there is a rule for how low of shutter speed you can handhold a camera. And this is important to know, is what's your limit on holding the camera for the photograph you're taking? And it looks a little complicated, but it's actually very simple. The minimum shutter speed is 1 over the focal length or faster. Now what this means is take a lens, like this lens, which is a 60 millimeter lens. You would need 1/60th of a second or faster to make sure that you're going to get sharp photos from that. Let's take a look at some other lenses. A 50 millimeter lens, well, it's pretty close to 60 in numbers, and so that would make sense at a 60th of a second. If you're going to use a telephoto lens like a 70 to 200, it depends a little bit on where you are zoomed at. You probably want to be somewhere between 125 and 250. It's good to kind of err on the faster side here to ensure sharpness. If you were going to be using a wide angle lens, you might be all the way down to a 15th or a 30th of a second. Now, one of the things that has come about in photography that is a big help in many different categories of photography is stabilization. Now, normally with an 85 millimeter lens, it would probably be smart to be at 125th of a second or faster. But some lenses, like this particular lens, has stabilization. On some, they're built into the lens, some they're built into the body, and this one has labeled at 4 stops of image stabilization, which means you can hold your camera all the way down to 1/8 of a second and get sharp photos. But the big warning for anyone doing portraits is that this only helps you, the photographer, shoot stationary. It doesn't help your subject from moving. And so even though you can hold the camera steady, it doesn't mean your subject is going to be able to remain steady. And so most people are moving around a little bit at 1/8 of a second, and this would not be suitable for portrait photography unless they were sitting down or in a very, very stable position. Now you will see the stabilization system built into lenses with many of the manufacturers. On other systems, you'll see it built into the body. In some cases, they combine and they use both together. So to sum up the shutter speeds, most of the time you're going to be at a 60 to 250th of a second. I tend to want to avoid 60, try to get to 125 and 250 if you have the light available to you. If subjects are moving around a little bit more quickly, you'll need one of those faster shutter speeds, or for exposure control, the very fast ones. There's some special effects with slow shutter speeds, and then there's a whole section that I generally wouldn't go for standard portraits.
Okay, let's play with shutter speed and movement. I'm actually going to start at a 60th of a second. We'll check John's stats to see how much movement we get at 60. Not ideal for portraiture, because if you miss that, get movement on the face or miss focus on the eye, you won't be happy, but super great for creative, artistic shots with lots of movement. So when I say elevate that knee, good girl, make sure you've got that dress and put your chin in place. I'm going to turn the fan on to give more movement to your hair. And I want, when I say go, I just want you to swish across, but stay focused on me like you're running towards me. Beautiful. There's my focus. I am at 60th of a second and go. Now you can see I've got a beautiful big swish on the skirt. And if we zoom on in, how much of that motion is nice and soft and how much of it is tack sharp. Beautiful. Now I'm going to take my shutter speed up to 100. Still slow, but we're going to see how much movement we're capturing in her fabric. And go. Beautiful, Kathleen. One more time just to get a nice swish of fabric. And go. Gorgeous. Now let's take our shutter speed to 500th of a second. Now we're making the shutter 5 times faster, so we are going to have to open up our aperture to let in a little bit more light. But technically at 500th of a second, you're going to stop a bird in flight. So everything should be tack sharp, no blur, no sort of nice soft edges. Okay, one more time and go. Beautiful. One more time for the fabric and go. Good girl, that was beautiful. Let's have a look at those and see movement. I absolutely love working with fabrics and movement but I never want to compromise the sharpness or the focus on the eyes. So when you are focused on learning your shutter speed, remember, try not to go under 1/25th of a second, especially handheld. If you do, go to a tripod to extra sturdy your camera so that you don't get motion blur.